Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our May 1st program for Weber Days. And this is Wednesday night, so this is Weber on Wednesday, or we call WOW. So thank you for being here. Glenn is going to wow you tonight. So I just wanted to point out that all of the Weber Day programs are under Weber Days on our calendar. And we have programs that teach people how to use genealogy, so if you're interested in that. Next Wednesday, our second WOW is the history of beer in Iowa City. There's kind of a beer theme here. No beer in here, but a beer theme for the programming. So Doug Alberhaski will talk about the history of beer and breweries in Iowa City, and he knows quite a bit. He's the proprietor of John's Grocery Store and has a lot of knowledge from his parents and his grandparents and ancestors even before that. Another genealogy program. We did have 2 history walks planned, but because of a number of circumstances, we won't be able to do those until next year. So if you signed up for those, you should have received a notification. We're not doing it, but look for it next year. We are doing a program at the Big Grove called History at the Big Grove. In fact, History at the Big Grove was where I heard Glenn give his Beer Riots program, and they could have beer there because it's a brewery. So next Wednesday, the Wednesday on May 15th, Melody Dvorak and I will be presenting a program called Birth of the Pedmal, History at the Grove presentation, and it will have lots and lots of images, and we have some stories, but we hope to get stories from other people as well. That's part of all of our Weber Days history. Another genealogy program, if you have littles, there's an Irving Weber story time, or if you want to come yourself, you can. The Johnson County Fair Queen is coming. We have a genealogy lock-in on Saturday, May 18th. That's open to anyone who would like to come. And then a couple more things. Sunday Fun Day, again, this is for children. And another program that is a family program, and this one looks very interesting. It's a mural walk with Thomas Agron, the Director of Public Art for the Downtown District. And that does require a reservation to do that. And then our final Wednesday program, our last WOW, is all in one room, a history of schools in Johnson County. And the Johnson County Historical Society will be here, as will Franklin Yoder, who did research for this book, and you'll be able to buy the book at that night and have it signed if you like. So, who doesn't know who Irving Weber is? You all know who Irving Weber is. Then I'm not going to tell you too much about Irving Weber, except that he's considered, scroll down here, he's considered Iowa City's official historian, and the reason he is Iowa City's official historian is because he was born in 1900 and lived till 1997, and he was instrumental in many, many things in Iowa City. There's an elementary school named after him, but the real reason that we are so tied to Irving Weber and promote local history with naming the month after him is because of the more than 800 columns he wrote for the Press Citizen. So the Iowa City Lions Club put together 8 volumes of his columns for the Press Citizen and published them, and the University of Iowa libraries digitized all of those books. And so we also had Lolly Eggers, who was our former library director 2 times ago, also wrote a biography of Irving Weber, and she had all of the columns Irving wrote for the Press Citizen. So we also, the Iowa City Public Library, digitized those as well, and they're all available through a link on our website or through the University of Iowa's digital collection. So he plays an instrumental role in what we do at the library when we're searching for historical documentation. And then we search some more to make sure that some of it is his memory, and you know how memories are, they can be expansive. So we have a lot of other resources, many of which Glenn is going to touch on tonight. So let me tell you a little bit about our speaker. As I said before, I heard this program, or something similar to this program, at History at the Grove. And if you're not familiar with History at the Grove, it's the 3rd Wednesday of every month, and they have all different kinds of programming. Not all related to beer, but many. Hence, it's a brewery, makes sense. So Glenn Ehrstine is the Associate Professor of German and International Studies at the University of Iowa, where he's been teaching since 1994. He works primarily on older German literature, particularly regarding religious theater and the cultural transformation that occurred between the late Middle Ages and the Reformation. That is not tonight's program. Since 2016, he has been helping research German immigration to Iowa for the university's Public Humanities Project on German Iowa and the Global Midwest. This program has helped him develop a new appreciation for local history, which we are very lucky that he has done that, and has led to his most recent publication, a co-translation with recent University of Iowa graduate Lucas Gibbs, Iowa's Prohibition. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Glenn. And we will have questions afterwards, so save your questions.
And I think the Lavelle, can you hear me all right now? Yeah, so, but we will be saving some time for questions later. Maeve will have the portable microphone, and if any of you have any questions, just let her know. We're going to save the questions for the end, but I can always backtrack on any slides that you'd like to take a look at again.
And then tell them the bonus they get for asking a question.
Oh, yes. We have many sponsors tonight, and I will be acknowledging all of them. I'll do my bad Vanna White imitation. Here is the notebook with Wunderbar Together, Germany and the US. This event is actually part of the Wunderbar Together initiative, which is sponsored by the German Studies Association, the Goethe Institute, and the German government in general. It's the year of German-American friendship. So if it's any incentive to ask a question, you get actually a rather nice notebook out of it. So we have these here. You can come over and take a look afterwards. Thank you, May, very much for that introduction. I am a little hoarse tonight. I hope it doesn't interfere at all. I'd like to thank Maeve and the Iowa City Public Library for inviting me. It was quite flattering, actually, after Maeve had heard the original talk. Maybe it was just the beer, Maeve, I'm not sure. But in any case, Maeve said, you know, we're planning our programming for Irving Weber Days. It would be great to have you come speak. And indeed, I'm wearing a slightly different hat tonight, but this project that I'm involved in, German Iowa and the Global Midwest, has really been a very nice opportunity for me to familiarize myself even better with local history. So I'll get to that in just a second. I'd like to, again, thank the Iowa City Public Library. I'd like to thank the German Studies Association for also, once Maeve and I had made these arrangements, the German Studies Association contacted me just to see whether there might be some local programming that might be suitable for the Wunderbar Together initiative. And so I was pleased to say, actually, I'll be speaking at the Iowa City Public Library. So I'd like to thank Janet Ward, the current vice president of the German Studies Association. I'd like to thank the Wunderbar Together initiative, which is sponsored and supported by the German Federal Foreign Office, the Federation of German Industries, and the Goethe Institute. And our project would not have been possible without the support of many numerous offices, units on campus at the University of Iowa. And I'd like specifically to thank the Office of the Vice President for Research, International Studies, and also the Obermann Institute of Advanced Studies, which kind of helped us get this project off the ground. So I'm just realizing I am a Mac user, but I normally can, as long as I find the mouse, yes, I think I can get to the beginning of the PowerPoint presentation. I'd like to thank Bond as well for her technical help tonight. She's hidden behind the door. Pay no attention to the woman behind the doors over here. Bond, I'm hoping I can actually step out here and address some of the slides. And if this is bad from a video perspective, actually it looks like the camera's on me right now. So if this is not appropriate for the filming, just let me know. I lived in Iowa City for at least 20 years without realizing that Iowa City had 3 German language newspapers over time. I'm not going to show you all of them, but I also, you certainly can hear foreign languages spoken on the street in Iowa City now. It's a very international community. It was a very international community already over 100 years ago. In the late 1800s, certainly in 1884, when these riots occurred. Main immigrant groups that weren't, if you will, US American, and these are still represented, among other things, by the churches in town. So here is the Iowa City Volksfreund. This was the first German language newspaper in Iowa City, started in 1874. And the German Catholic community worshiped here in St. Mary's. All of you know St. Mary's, of course. Then, as you know, both Cedar Rapids and Iowa City were the home for a large Czech Bohemian community. So you have, actually predating the Volksfreund, you have the Slovan Ameriky, which was a local Czech newspaper. And then you probably know St. Wenceslas, which is where the Czech community worshiped. They actually worshiped together with the Germans at St. Mary's, and at some point they were able to raise enough money for their own community so that they could conduct their worships in Czech. Okay, and then there is the Irish. The Irish could certainly, they conversed in English. Their lingua franca was English, but they're also represented in local churches. This is St. Patrick's Church, which this one, as many of you will know, unfortunately no longer exists, thanks to the tornado we had in 2007 or so. Six. So this structure was a beautiful structure, was destroyed by the tornado, but St. Patrick's now has a new church out on the eastern edge of town. So this is, if it helps you to think of these three communities, the German community in the state was by far the largest immigrant community. I'm not actually sure of the numbers here in Iowa City. I know the Czechs were also quite populous, and both the Germans and the Czechs, they tended to live on the north side in Goosetown, among other places. And we'll see a little bit of that in a moment. I'm going to be talking about, if you will, immigrants gone wild tonight. I just want to take a moment to say that these immigrant communities also contributed significantly to the community and local culture, local history. For those of you who live in the peninsula, and I know some of you do, you may know Moses Bloom Lane. This is named for the proprietor of Bloom's One Price Clothing House on Clinton Street. And he would advertise also in the German papers, in the Czech papers, et cetera. And then he was elected mayor in 1874. And depending on what counts as a larger American city, he is often considered, if you go on Wikipedia, he's mentioned as the first Jewish mayor of a large American city. He originally came from Alsace, but he was German-speaking. He identified as German. Then you also have Emma Harvat, who certainly if you have attended a town council meeting in the city hall, you know that the chambers, council chambers there, are named for Emma Harvat. She was a proprietor. She ran a clothing store right actually in the Jefferson building. And she was mayor from 1922 to 1925, to some degree certainly one of the first women mayors in the United States. Then let's just go back in time to the scene of the action, perhaps the crime, if you will. This is this well-known bird's eye view of Iowa City in 1868. We're going to be zeroing in on this part of town, the near north side, Market Street, more or less. And this is a close-up of that image. And you'll see here, all of you recognize St. Mary's. What might be surprising to you, where's Van Allen Hall? Of course, Van Allen Hall wasn't built yet. And this square here was known as Church Park. And this is where the witnesses for the prosecution were accosted and nearly shot after the trial out in Scott Township. But then this is also where the local breweries were located. Two of these breweries no longer exist. City Brewery here, that's the parking lot between the High Grounds Coffee House and the lawyer's offices. Then here, the Great Western Brewery, that's the parking lot between George's and Bluebird Diner. But what still exists here is Union Brewery. And we'll see these images, see these breweries here in a second, because now we're going to meet the defendants, because this riot also led to a trial. So this is the patriarch of the Englert family, Louis Englert, who came over to Iowa City from the Bavarian Palatinate. He came up the Mississippi by steamship. He was still alive in 1884. He sold his brewery sometime in 1881 or so to his son, John J. Englert. And it's the third generation. The first wife of John J. Englert died young, and then John J. Englert remarried. It's the son from the first marriage who, together with his wife, founds the Englert Theater as the third generation of this family here. So that's Louis Englert. I am grateful to the Iowa Gen Web website on the Englert family, from where I pulled this image. But you see, this is the larger Englert clan, which also married into one of the Englert daughters, married Jacob J. Hotz, who was a local contractor. He's responsible for many structures. And here's the older Louis Englert right here. And then here is John J. Englert. So he's going to be one of the participants in the riots. Unfortunately, I don't have pictures of the other two brewers, but this is an ad from the Iowa City Volksfreund for the Great Western Brewery, which was the second brewery founded in town. It was also the largest at some point. We'll be talking about Prohibition. It had to close during the 10-year period of Prohibition that started in 1884, but then it was reopened later, and eventually it was bought in the early 20th century and was renamed Iowa Brewing Company. So some of you may have actually seen, well, first we have the older image. This is what it looked like right around the time of the riots. So this is 1882. Dostal was advertising in the Czech papers as well. And then this is what it looked like after it was expanded, renamed the Iowa Brewing Company. And as I mentioned, this is the current site of Bluebird Diner, and this is where George's is located. The structure obviously no longer survives. The reason this is a parking lot is because there are beer cellars, beer caves underneath. And if you were to actually develop that property, you would have to first go down and remove all of that. So the Iowa State real estate market is heating up increasingly. At some point, it probably will be worth the developer's money to go in and dig it up. But it's city property, so I don't think that is necessarily likely to happen. Not sure. The Dostal was perhaps the wealthiest brewer in town. This was his mansion, which no longer survives, but it was on the corner of Van Buren and Bloomington Streets, and it was purchased in the mid-1880s by Mercy Hospital. So basically, where Mercy Hospital is nowadays, that's where John Dostal had his residence, which was obviously within a block's walk of his brewery. So it was right by the breweries. Some of the older homes, brick homes that are still there, the gynecologist's office and the other brick home north of, probably west of Union Brewery, Brewery Square, those were also related to the breweries. So this is now Mercy Hospital. This is the structure then that you will likely recognize. This is Brewery Square today. This is what it looked like around 1903. It was founded originally by Simeon Hotz and Anton Geiger in 1868, right after the Civil War, as the Union Brewery. Conrad Graf started as their brewmaster. Graf conveniently married Simon Hotz's daughter, Annie, and then he assumed ownership of the brewery in 1883. And around 1884, he employed 10 men. Given that he just bought the brewery in 1883, you can imagine that he has a very vested interest in keeping this brewery open and running and trying to recoup his investment in this brewery in 1884 when Prohibition hits. So that's one of the underlying factors for his, shall we say, bad behavior, or certainly the bad behavior of his supporters. Okay, and then just a couple of historical images of what the Union Brewery looked like. So this was before the expansion. This is the smaller scale brewery. And then you'll see, I think it was already expanded under Hotz and Geiger, but in any case, once Graf takes over, he adds this section here, which extends out towards the west. This all still exists today. This is otherwise a somewhat abstract or this image just focuses on the brewery. So obviously this would have been downtown in the background, but the idea here is you just focus on the brewery. There's an ice house, there's stables. This is how you delivered the beer at the time. The brewers and the brewing industry was a major economic factor in Iowa. This was, there was, it provided employment, and it, in some ways, helped provide or take the one cash crop that farmers were growing at the time, which was less corn and soybeans and more barley. So barley, in many ways, was a cash crop, and you can see right here, it's, oops, sorry, getting ahead of things. Many of the brewers at the time are constantly advertising, we want your barley. Bring in your barley farmers, and we'll give you the best prices for it. Okay, so these are brewers. Some people, Marlon Ingalls, a local historian and state archaeologist, has referred to these men as the German mafia. In any case, they were wealthy, influential, and they were used to having their way. Let's put it that way. Okay. Then you get the rising tide of temperance in the mid-19th century. So many of you have heard of Carrie Nation, who would enter a saloon with her axe and give the proprietor usually an opportunity to destroy his store of whiskey and any other alcoholic beverages he had. And if the proprietor did not comply, she would get active with her axe. Here you have a more abstract version of this. And here, this is an image from this illustrated magazine at the time, Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. It was often common to first hold a prayer vigil, prayer rally at a local church. The pastor then would often proceed out of the church then with many women, not just. In fact, the earliest temperance groups, which we'll see here, were the Sons of Temperance. But this was, in many ways, a woman's movement in the mid to the late 19th century. And part of the problem was their men at home, their husbands, were drinking. Inebriation, drunkenness was a problem at the time. So this was a way for women to take matters into their own hands and try and correct the situation. And here we just have a brief history of Prohibition groups in Iowa who, over time, effectively lobbied the Republican Party in the state legislature to increasingly adopt laws restricting the consumption and manufacture of alcoholic beverages. So already in 1850, you have the Sons of Temperance, then the Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded in 1873. They, in many ways, this is their proceedings here. You can actually read them in the Women's Archive here on campus. They were, in many ways, the largest and most influential temperance group. But then you just see there are all sorts of other groups, including here this Law and Order League. They provided legal support to ensure that these prohibition laws, once they were passed, were enforced. This is a local landmark in Shenandoah, Iowa, a public drinking fountain sponsored by the Women's Christian Temperance Union with the idea that you don't need to go to the bar to quench your thirst. If you're thirsty, here, we're going to provide you with clean drinking water in public. Please don't have a beer, just drink some water. And that's remarkable. That's a sort of artifact from the time. Here's a certificate from the Band of Hope. And this is actually for Charlie Wienicke, who was the son of the proprietor of Fink's Bazaar, which was the cigar and bookstore in the Jefferson Hotel before that burned down, and it is now the site of Iowa Book and Supply. And so this is a pledge to refrain from alcohol. And if you went, for example, to the county fair, you would encounter women or members from the Women's Christian Temperance Union who would then actively ask you to sign a pledge for temperance and promise not to drink alcohol. So this movement over time leads to 4 periods of prohibition. You have it very early on in 1855, even before the Republican Party is formed in the Whig legislature at the time. They passed a fairly strict prohibition law. It was, however, modified in 1857 by the Republican legislature to allow for the manufacture of beer, wine, and cider made from Iowa-grown grain and fruit. So as long as your alcohol was made in the state, you were fine. And of course, this, pardon me, this acknowledged the economic importance of this particular industry. Technically, spirits were not legal, but this law was simply not enforced. So you could pretty much get whatever you wanted to in terms of alcohol up until, pardon me, up until 1882. I'm going to just pause to get a sip of water here. Then, in the course of the 1870s, there gradually, public support for temperance grows slowly, and the Republican Party is increasingly being asked by a lot of its voters to please adopt a party platform in support of temperance. The Republicans don't want to bind themselves that closely to a controversial issue, so they say, well, what we will do is we'll put the matter to the voters. We will hold a referendum throughout the state, and we will ask everyone, do you want a constitutional amendment? Would you support a constitutional amendment that would forbid the manufacture and sale of alcohol? And lo and behold, this measure passes very narrowly. And of course, there are wide fluctuations in support or opposition throughout the state. But in any case, it passes. But then, due to a procedural error, because the House version of the bill or the amendment and the Senate version of the bill were off by a half sentence, by a clause, that voided the amendment. So the Iowa Supreme Court voids this. And then the decision is made, okay, we will now enact legislation to prohibit the manufacture and consumption of alcohol. So starting in 1884, this prohibition law goes into effect, and it lasts for 10 years. The riots occur within 5 weeks of the passing of this law, which goes into effect on July 4th. And then, of course, we have national prohibition. Iowa, as was the case in some other states as well, gets on the bandwagon a little early. So Iowa passes another state prohibition law in 1917, and then you get national prohibition beginning in 1920. So these are these 4 periods, and we're really going to be talking about July 4th, what's happening up, in the forefront of July 4th, and what happens afterwards. So try as it might, there was this local Brewers Association, Iowa State Brewers Association. They lobbied actively against this law, but to no avail. And this is just some of their platform. They took out advertisements. And this was the head of the Brewers Association, Christian Magnus. If anyone's possibly down here from Cedar Rapids, this was the Eagle Brewery this was the main brewery in Cedar Rapids, and it was quite large. So it sold in Des Moines, it sold throughout the eastern part of the state. It was located where the Quaker Oats plant is now, and it was demolished in 1937. So we're going to hear from this Christian Magnus here in just a second. Right now, this is the countdown to July 4th, when this will go into effect. And everyone's stockpiling their reserves of whiskey. They don't want to be left dry, high and dry, literally. The Germans try and get organized. They want to have a picnic. I don't know whether this actually took place, but there was a call to have this big demonstration on July 3rd as a counter demonstration to the temperance-oriented 4th of July celebration. And then this is a poem that was being published in several newspapers actually throughout the state, The Last Glass. And just at the very end here, I'll actually give you the last 4 lines. So drink up, trinkt aus, die Tränen, my tears, rinnen mir wohl gar noch in mein letztes Bier. So my tears are pouring down my cheek into my beer. Zum Wohl, o welch ein Spott und Hohn, verdammt seist du, Prohibition. So rough translation, cheers, oh what derision, damn you, Prohibition. So one was at least trying to take it with a little bit of humor, but then you get Conrad Graf, who decides that he's going to, right off the bat, try and challenge the law. So he had just purchased the Union Brewery from his father-in-law, probably made significant investments. He doesn't want to lose that money. So he basically, up front, this is a column here from the Iowa City Post. A reporter of the Cedar Rapids Republican interviewed the proprietor of the Union Brewery, Mr. Conrad Graf, here at the 4th, and gives the following account thereof. Actually on July 4th, a large brewery was in full operation and 16,000 glasses of beer were disposed of to the thirsty Athenians. That would be the Iowa Cityans, the Athens of the West. Before 6 p.m., when the utter exhaustion of the employees of the establishment compelled the reluctant proprietor to close his doors. This brewer was Conrad Graf, and to learn something of his expectations, a reporter called upon him. "Do you expect to be permitted to run your brewery, Mr. G?" the reporter asked. "No, I suppose I will be arrested, but I will carry the case to the Supreme Court and show the people that they might not have no right to take my property. Are you backed by the Brewers Association, and do you expect to succeed in bucking the law?" "No, the Brewers Association does not support me, but I do expect to win the suit. I will be arrested tomorrow, but I am advised by my attorney to stand firm. Other prominent men whom I might name will also support me. I intend to fight this out to the bitter end." So he alludes to support he has in the community, but it's very clear to him he acknowledges, I actually don't have the support of the Brewers Association. And then you get a statement from the president of the Brewers Association. And this is interesting for what at the time was already a little, if you will, cultural divide between Lynn County and Johnson County. Mr. Magnus of Cedar Rapids, president, Iowa Brewers Association, on being interviewed by a Republican reporter, said, "I don't approve of the course taken by Conrad Graf, the Iowa City brewer. I do not see how he can well construe the law as he does. Of course, Johnson County is worse, more liberal than Lynn, and it may be impossible to convict him there. It looks as though Graf would be the first case tried, as I have heard of no other one occurring either in Davenport or Dubuque. So, as I told you once before, he is not supported by the Brewers Association, and if he fights the law, he must do so on his own account." And I'll just leave that there. So Graf is going into this, eyes wide open, if you will. And he wasn't arrested the next day. It took until July 7th because there was a weekend. So July 4th apparently was a Friday. July 7th is the Monday, and then first thing Monday morning, 2 warrants of arrest are issued for Graf under the new law, 1 for selling beer, 1 for keeping a nuisance. More suits follow later, and they're all sort of under the aegis of the State Temperance Alliance. So the State Temperance Alliance is making sure we're going to keep the pressure on Graf. We're not going to let him get away with this. And then you get more lawsuits filed, and finally on July 22nd, Graf's lawyers reached an agreement with attorneys for the opposing side, and this is a newspaper clipping here regarding that. They agreed to dismiss all lawsuits against Graf in return for Graf's compliance with an injunction to shut his brewery down. So this is more or less a gentleman's agreement between the brewers, at least Conrad Graf, and the temperance supporters and their lawyers, where Graf says, okay, all right, I'll shut my brewery down. I'll respect this. I will actually file for an allowance, a permit to reopen at a later point, but right now I'll shut the brewery down. And the lawyers for the temperance advocates then also in return promise, okay, we're not going to bother you with any other lawsuits. So this was the truce that's reached on July 22nd. The truce does not hold. And here, just note that these are the attorneys for the plaintiff, Remley, Robinson, and Patterson, Youngkin. Later, this attorney is going to be popping up, W.H. Bailey. He is not a signatory to this agreement, and he is then the main lawyer who then files suit against Dostal and Graf, which leads to the riots. So Graf shuts down his brewery, but he applies to receive a special permit. The temperance advocates, however, they're determined to make sure that Graf is not going to be able to reopen his brewery. So there's a petition that goes around. He doesn't get enough voters to testify that he's of good moral character, and then one of the other attorneys for the Temperance Alliance further works to prevent Graf's permit by submitting over 400 signatures against Graf. So this fosters the bad blood between the brewers and the temperance advocates. The brewers are also not willing to adhere to the truce, or at least they threaten violence. So even before the riots, you have this threat here. Anonymously by this poorly spelled Hickory Club. Sirs, you and your cooperators in the Prohibition question are hereby notified that if there is any more trouble in the cause, there will be somebody badly hurt. We attend to our own business and ask you to do the same. If you want to go talking temperance, do so, but keep your nose out of our business. Take this as a warning, or you will hear from us. So again, tensions continue to build, and then this is the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will. On August 11th, this other lawyer, W.H. Bailey, files suit against Graf and Dostal. Moreover, he doesn't file the suit in Iowa City. He files it in Scott Township. So this trial is going to have to be held outside of town, in Scott Township. And there's a reason for that, which we'll get to in just a second. And this from the brewer's perspective, this then violates this general agreements. And they then also feel that they're no longer bound by any of these previous agreements. And they're ready for violence. So August 13, tensions boil over. Here's where Scott Township is. And in a moment, I'll show you some voting records concerning the support of Prohibition in this township. So everyone has to ride out by buggy to where the trial is being held at this Justice of the Peace's house. And I'll just, there's obviously a lot of people involved in this. Here are the cast of characters. You have up to 200 rioters in support of Graf, Dostal, and Englert. You have various officers of the law. You have these witnesses who apparently had been subpoenaed to testify. They had no choice in the matter. They would rather have not appeared, as I understand it, but they were being compelled to testify against the brewers. And then here's the Shell family. And I'll read through this. I don't want to read through every slide, and I also want to be mindful of our time. As attorneys Bailey and Main ride out to the trial at the home of Justice Shell, they are followed by bandwagons of anti-prohibitionists. As the crowd waits for the trial to begin, they first surround the Swafford brothers. So they were the witnesses for the prosecution. But when Bailey appears to collect documents from defense lawyers, they accost him, strip him naked, and tar him. Bailey manages to free himself. He takes refuge in the house with the help of the law officers. The crowd then surrounds the house and demands that the lawyers and witnesses be delivered to him. So this is part one of this event. And eventually, apparently Mrs. Shell truly was sick upstairs in bed, and the law officers are later able to come out and say, look, there's a sickly old woman in the house. You should just go home. Please, let's put an end to this. And they do, but in the meantime then, these witnesses, the Swaffords, had also managed to get away unnoticed while this other stuff is going on. They walk back to town, and then they're seen. They're identified by other people returning from the riots, and so there's a second round of this. The Swafford brothers had left Justice Shell's house when the unrest started. They returned to town, entered a hardware store to purchase revolvers on the advice of friends. They were noticed by returning rioters, and when they exited the store, they were followed by hecklers. They did their best to ignore the growing crowd and continue home. And then here is Church Park. When they reached Church Park, the crowd including Graf and Englert, set upon them. Two onlookers, Horace Kimball and Frank Schell, were able to free C.G. Swafford from his assailants. The crowd then turned on Schell, but he was able to hold them at bay with his revolver. Deputy Farrell arrested one of the perpetrators, but the man was torn from his hands by other rioters. The Swaffords took refuge in a nearby store and were then escorted to the city jail for their own protection. Police accompanied them home at 11 p.m. and stood watch. So that was round two. And then by evening, then cooler heads prevail. Dostal, as one of the brewers, puts out word that the Swaffords and the attorney, Bailey, are not to be harmed. It wasn't clear whether Dostal could control the mob. He could. There's this other incident I'll just kind of skip over where they wanted to maybe string someone up, another lawyer. There was considerations whether the Iowa Militia needed to be sent to town to keep the peace. Local officials, advised also by this Adjutant General Baker, sort of assessed the situation and decided, no, we don't need the militia, but we're going to keep an eye on things. However, arrest warrants were then also issued for Graf and Englert, and there's a subsequent trial, which we'll get to here. Despite the violence, most Iowa City residents opposed the new Prohibition law and tended to side with the brewers. So here's an anonymous letter saying, you know, this is really the fault of these lawyers. And what sort of can tip us off to this difference of opinion? This is taken here from a History of Johnson County, published in 1883, which is right after this 1882 referendum vote on the Prohibition Amendment in the state constitution. So you can just see here, these are the various townships in Johnson County. You get total votes cast, how many were for the amendment, in other words, how many supported Prohibition, and how many were against the amendment. If you just jump all the way down to Iowa City, okay, you can tell, particularly on the north side, where those Germans and Czechs were living, there was strong opposition to the Prohibition Amendment. There's also strong opposition to the south, but it's clearly even stronger in the north. If you look at all these other townships and then look at Scott, Scott Township is the most pro-Prohibition township within Johnson County. So in other words, it was not an accident that the lawyer filed suit and forced the plaintiffs to come out to Scott Township. That was where, depending on your point of view, if you were a temperance advocate, this was the only place in Johnson County you were going to get a fair trial for these brewers, or at least a trial that would respect the letter of the law. The brewers, of course, wanted the venue, the jurisdiction, to be Iowa City because they could be assured of a very sympathetic judge, sympathetic jurors, possibly. So the fact that all this was moved out to Scott Township was, from the brewers' perspective, also a violation of this gentleman's agreement. So in the German Iowa press, there are all sorts of, they blame the prohibitionists. They have all sorts of excuses as to why this violence was warranted. This is a translation of a column that actually ran in Illinois. This made national news, at least among German Americans. Two respected brewers of Iowa City, the county seat, were dragged in front of a justice of the peace out in the country, namely in Scott Township, not at the instigation of the district attorney. In other words, this was not the government enforcing its own laws. This was from this private lawyer of the local Law and Order Society. And then you have an aftermath, which goes on for a while. It doesn't really take place, the final trial doesn't take place until 1886, but the Swaffords filed a lawsuit for $20,000 in damages against Graf, Englert, Dostal, Hotz, who was the son-in-law of, or if you were the brother-in-law of John J. Englert, and others. The plaintiffs request a change of venue to Iowa County due to the prejudice of the people and the undue influence of the defendants over the inhabitants of Johnson County. And then Englert himself requests another change of venue from a circuit to district court due to the prejudice of the presiding judge in Iowa County. And the trial eventually takes place in Marion in May to June of 1886. Swafford wins, and he was awarded $7,000, which was a nice chunk of change in 1886. This is just a little overview of how the issue of prohibition in general affected voting patterns among German Americans, and how German Americans, German Iowans, were actually able to sway politics then in Iowa. There were plenty of German Americans who supported the Republican Party. So these are voting patterns in 14 predominantly German Iowa counties. Predominantly Republican here. Then there's the referendum, which doesn't get much support from German American voters. And then you can see, once Prohibition gets put into place, support for the Republican Party among German Iowans drops to 44%, 36. And it's not until the repeal of the law that support goes back up again. And to some extent, due to the influence of these German American, German Iowa voters, they are able then to vote in the only Democratic party, the only Iowa governor from the Democratic Party elected between 1855 and 1933. This is Horace Boyce, who had been a Republican and then switched parties. And this is from the State Anzeiger, which was the leading state newspaper in Des Moines. So German Iowans were quite happy when Prohibition was finally over. And here's just, this is also an editorial cartoon from this same newspaper. Prohibition killed it, the end of the Prohibition Party in Iowa. Republican Party, temperance medicine. So Republican Party is not taking well to its temperance medicine. This just gives you an overview of settlement patterns. These were where German Americans settled, and the darker counties are predominantly, or where the density of German Americans is greatest. And then if you look at counties that actually then voted against Prohibition in 1882, these are the red counties, you can see there's a fair amount of overlap between those counties, particularly along the rivers, along Missouri and Mississippi. And it was Johnson County's fate. This is a map also taken from a study on liquor legislation from 1903. The cross-hatched or striped counties, that's where saloons disappeared after the 1884 Prohibition law. And it's in the counties where there is predominant German Iowan population. They can just snub their nose at the law. In Johnson County, there's just not quite enough critical mass, if you will, for German Iowans locally to really buck the tide of Prohibition. And this was part of also the underlying causes for the riots. They try as they might, they just didn't have enough local support. Okay. And this gives you an idea of how the Prohibition law impacts the number of breweries in Iowa. So in 1878, you had as many as 138 small breweries throughout the state. Boom, that number drops precipitously then to 23 in 1890. It does start to rise again, but if you look at the total production, the number never really goes up but the production does substantially. And this is also a period of consolidation where you have the large brewers such as Anheuser-Busch, Pabst, Schlitz, et cetera. They're consolidating their market, and refrigeration is the new technology which allows these brewers then to export their wares, their product over larger distances. So you didn't have to have your local brewery. You could go to John's Grocery, which was, as a saloon earlier, a distributor for, I think it's for Pabst. Okay. Here's just a little postscript. The Graf Brewery was state prohibition. During national prohibition, it shifted its business to soda making. It, however, had to move its operations north on Lynn Street to what is now the empty lot between Pagliai's Pizza and Hamburger Inn No. 2. They could no longer stay in the old brewery because lingering yeast spores caused the soda to ferment. So you could get alcoholic red pop, and apparently that didn't go over well. So, but anyways, here's the Graf's Bottling Works celebrating its time in Iowa City. This is for the 100th anniversary of the city that appeared in the Press Citizen. Okay, I'm almost done here. You can find out more about this information yourself due in part to this lovely new collection of historic newspapers that the public library has put together. So you've already seen this clipping. If you go to the original newspaper, you'll also see this, which runs in the column right next door. You could read about how the Iowa City baseball team really handed it to the Marion team at the time and gave them a thrubbing. And I will, let's see if I find the mouse, just go here quickly so that you can see what this site looks like. So you get first a brief overview, browse by title. If you click more, you can then really see just how many different titles there are. And you can go down, and here's where the German ones start. So Iowa City Post is German. The Volksfreund is down here, right here. And just to give you an idea of what you can get, you can just go, you can do searches, and it'll load, and it looks a little weird as it's loading, but then it should happen now. Pretty quick. Well, okay. Take my word for it. Okay, it should. It's actually loading rather slowly. My apologies for that. Well, in any case, maybe it'll show up later. But you can look at all these papers, particularly if you read German, but all sorts of English papers as well. And that, more or less, is the end of my talk. I did want to at least close with sharing with you the image of our project here, which is German Iowa and the Global Midwest. We also have a website there as well. So thank you for your time and attention. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. I learned even more than when I was at the brewery. And it has nothing to do with drinking beer.
There are advantages to public libraries.
But, so I have a question. When you talk about Germans and drinking, are the German Catholics and the German Lutherans any different, or are they both imbibers?
They are both imbibers. It was the German Methodists who were the teetotalers. So they rejected alcohol. But otherwise, there was really no distinction just in terms of these drinking habits. In fact, when did you go to the local beer garden? You went on Sunday after church. And for German Americans, there was no discrepancy between being God-fearing, attending your church service, and then going out afterwards. And this would be a family event. So Davenport is famous for its Schützenpark, which was, the Schützen are the marksmen. The park still survives, but it had a bowling alley, it had a roller coaster, it had a shooting range, and it had a beer garden, and you could just go and relax with the family. Of course, from a more puritanical perspective, this was true blasphemy, that you would actually deign to drink alcohol on a Sunday. That was a snub towards the Lord. And Irish did it as well.
Of course. Do we have any? I'm going to pass you this, Maggie, so you can be heard over the.
Other than the embarrassment of being stripped and tarred, was being tarred a painful process? Was this like hot tar?
I believe it's hot pitch, so I think the tarring process itself could be quite painful.
We could do that for a Weber Day.
I unfortunately have never really read a sort of a personal account, but I don't think feathering was involved in this particular case, but I think this is hot pitch. It had to be, quite hot. Perhaps like getting wax poured over your skin perhaps even to a greater extent then. I don't know how quickly it cooled off.
And other than that, gentlemen, were other people injured during these?
Well, the Swafford brothers were suffered physical injuries as well. They were beaten. And really, if one of those other men hadn't pulled the crowd off the Swafford brothers, they might have actually gotten strung up. So there was a real danger that someone was going to get strung up.
Do you know whether the university had any opinions on this? Did you read anything about university students taking part?
That's an excellent question. I don't know. I honestly don't know. I know that university students were drinking beer. I know, but from what I understand about the riders, it was largely the employees of these breweries and sometimes their extended family, or anyone really whose livelihood depended on the continued operation of the breweries. So these could be teamsters who were transporting the beverage, maintenance people, and really, a broader community that felt this to be an affront to their way of life. They viewed it as an attack on their personal liberty. That was the rallying cry.
I also wondered whether the hops were grown locally.
I'm sure they were grown somewhere in Iowa. I don't know how local the hops market was, but most of these operations were locally based. So somewhere in town, somewhere within Johnson County, likely, hops were being grown. I know one of my colleagues, Glenn Penny in history, who was also part of this project, he had a student who came from a smaller town in northern Iowa. I unfortunately forget the name, but some local archaeologists had recently discovered the foundation for a building no one kind of knew was there. People had forgotten about it. And they did a little digging, and they dug up hops seeds or spores. In any case, it wasn't until they found the hops that they realized this was the brewery.
Oh.
Hops is a flowering plant, so it would be seeds that were found.
Okay. I'm glad to know that.
Have you done any research about the riots in Ann Arbor about this?
No, I have not.
Because my family was part of the German community in Ann Arbor,
Okay.
and they resisted Prohibition strenuously. And I'm not sure they ever were able to forced to comply.
Right.
You might want to look at that.
I would love to, in part because I'm from southeastern Michigan, so my sister lives right outside of Ann Arbor.
Okay, well,
And it's, I'm just curious, was it Swabian descent? Because I think most of the German Americans around Ann Arbor were from Swabia.
Some of them were from Alsace-Lorraine.
Okay,
And from the Black Forest. That's where my family.
okay. Thank you.
You mentioned, you showed a correlation between saloons that were able to stay in business and large and a critical mass of a German population.
Right.
And I was curious if in any of the the temperance propaganda you may have gone through, if there were targeted. If there was language targeted against Germans specifically, or even you had mentioned, Lutherans and Catholics were imbibers, if Methodist temperance propagandists mention Catholics and Lutherans, sort of single out Catholics and Lutherans as imbibers who need to temper their drinking.
I don't know of any documentation of that from this particular period, but I do know these records here that are in the Iowa Women's Archive. The Iowa Women's Archives also have a strong collection of suffrage materials. And these issues start to overlap around 1914, 1917. So there is a state initiative at the state level to introduce women's suffrage. And the German newspapers all come out strongly opposed to this because they're worried that women will vote for once you give women the vote, what are they going to do? They're going to vote for prohibition. They're going to take away our beer. And so this is the persecution complex, if you will, or that's not a good term, but there's this genuine anxiety. So then in the literature of the Iowa Women's Suffrage Association, if I'm recalling the name correctly, this is not only after this referendum fails, so it's put to a vote, it fails, unfortunately, but this is then also after the U.S. enters World War I against the Germans. And at this point, the Women's Temperance Association, or the Suffrage Association says, who's to blame for Iowa women not getting the vote? It's the German Americans. And I have some of that on my hard drive. This is my colleague, Michael Swellender, so I'm able to just pass some of this on directly.
I think I recall several years ago having a tour of one of the cellars in the north part of town.
Yes.
Are they still in existence?
They are
Is
still in
it
existence. So
possible to still do something like that?
This is the underneath the Union Brewery. And in fact, I wouldn't have time for it right now, but if you give me an email address, or I don't know.
We have a program that Marlon Engels did for us. So all of our Weber Days programs are on the library channel at YouTube. And so you can see a program where Marlon goes into the beer caves underneath where Brewery Square is. That's where the caves are located that you can get into with the right permission. And he also talks about the Cedar Rapids Brewery at the same time. So I guess we've had a long history of beer programs for Weber Days because it was such an instrumental part of Iowa City's history.
I will, so they still exist. Marlon Ingalls, they actually considered opening this up as a pub or some sort of nightclub bar. There were too many safety and fire issues.
You have to be able to get out of it.
There used to be an elevator. There was a fire down here, down in the caves at one point. And so there was an elevator for moving the large kegs and barrels. That burned. So right now there's only a sort of rickety metal step ladder by which you can then descend into the cellars. And the university has this LiDAR scanning, three-dimensional scanning project. So I'll just get this going. So these are the beer caves that are currently under Brewery Square. They're still there. So they're under LaJames College of Beauty.
Yes.
And you can't just walk in. You have to get the permission from the owner and from the business. But then this is a fly-through video of this scan that they did. I'll just start this, let it start running, and then if you want to take another question, you can.
And I know that Doug Alberhaske, when he comes next Wednesday to talk about the history of beer in Iowa City, has a lot to say about this too, because he grew up right in the middle of all of it. Kevin, did you have a?
Yeah, my only question was around, is the site where in Scott Township, the farmhouse or the location, have you identified where that is?
I have not. I'm guessing it would be possible. You could check property records and find out where this Justice Shell resided, where his homestead was.
Yep.
So yeah, that would be interesting.
Yeah, I just didn't know if I'll take a look at doing it. I just didn't know if you'd already done the homework.
No, I would be intrigued.
Yeah.
There are a whole lot of leads I would love to follow up on, and at some point I just have to say I have some papers to grade.
Right.
So.
Well, and it's, Glenn talked about the newspapers, and once you put your toe in the newspapers online, you're just lost because you can't stop. There's just so much in there. You can see advertisements.
There's the ladder.
This is fascinating.
There's actually two of them, one over the other. One was too short. You had to like really step down.
And there are, what is the metal around around the barrel? Because that's what was
Oh,
left.
the hoops, so there were.
The staves burnt and the
Yeah.
hoops remain.
Exactly. So the kegs burned, and then these. Okay. I think we'll have to wait until we backtrack and go into the other one. You see it a little better there. But there are the hoops, the metal hoops that were around the barrels. The wood burned, and then those kind of fell to the ground. Then.
Oops, wait.
Do these beer caves extend under the street to the parking lot next to George's? Are they interconnected? And
So the caves themselves do not. However, there are chopped off tunnels. So there was a whole tunnel network underneath the north side. And supposedly, I even talked to an older resident, senior resident, who said back in the 50s or 60s, they had gone down into the cellars under the Union Brewery and had come out on the other side of the street near George's. A lot of those passageways are blocked off now. Pardon me. Oh, well, this is we're going to see Marlon Ingalls here. This is what just comes up. So this is the entrance into the shaft. And you can find this also on YouTube, Cave of Forgotten Beers. This is Marlon Ingalls, who was with the Office of the State Archaeologist, and he would conduct these tours.
are any of these protected resources in any way?
Like
Are they landmarked, or are they listed, or is anyone?
I believe the brewery itself has landmark designation.
And do you know if the caves under it are included? And the caves under it are included also? Okay.
Probably. It's a good. They might be. I know that if you go to the State Historical Society, they preserve the original write-up and investigation for the application to place that structure under landmark designation when it was rehabbed in the 80s.
Yeah, and I think you can find all that online now. So thank you very much, Glenn. This was
Thank you
wonderful.
for your time. I appreciate
and
it.
if you're interested in more of Iowa City beer, which probably is why you're here tonight, I think Doug is going to have a very interesting program for us. He has a lot of slides and a lot of history of Iowa City in beer making and beer selling. And he has great stories about little kids going to bars. Well, I'm not going to finish it. You just have to come to the program. So thank you again, Glenn. This is wonderful.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.